everybody, Dave Thomas here again with another model rocket build, and today I'm building the Estes Yankee. This is a minimum diameter, minimal parts rocket that goes together fairly quickly. And as usual, we'll go ahead and check and make sure that everything is here. So we've got a body tube, an engine spacer, and if you don't see this right away, it might have got stuck up inside the body tube there, so check there. Some self-stick decals, streamer, shock cord, and launch lug, fin material, and engine block and the aft part of the nose cone, and then the nose cone itself. And that's all there is to it. Now, one of the really nice things about this rocket is it teaches you how to use fin stock. Okay, so if we look at the fin material here, it just gives us 2 sheets of balsa. These are not pre-marked, they're not die cut or laser cut or anything. You'll have to cut these out yourself. And this is a handy skill to have. So our first step is to assemble the nose cone as shown here in the instructions. And again, the base of the nose cone is in the same package as the fin material. And also the engine block. I'm just going to set that aside. And what we need to do here is simply take some plastic model cement. If you don't have this, thick super glue will work as well. And we're just going to put a small amount of this right around the inside of the nose cone. You don't want to get too much of this or it can actually melt the nose cone. I've had that happen on a few rockets in the past. And then we'll take our base here and just push that in and just give it a little bit of a turn to seat it well, and then we can just set this aside. Alright, the next thing we need to do is cut out the fins. And there is a guide for this on the front page. However, on the back page of that guide is the instructions for putting in the engine block. I'm going to go ahead and do this part first so I don't have to worry about coming back and figuring out where I was supposed to put it after I'd cut things out of this. And it doesn't matter. Frankly, I think it's easier to do this step before we put the fins on. So now we're going to need our body tube, the engine block, and our engine spacer, as well as some white glue or wood glue. Okay, and we need to make a mark on the rear or aft end at 6 millimeters or 1/4 inch. That's going to be right there. And then we're going to put a bead of glue up inside here about 2 inches up. Alright, to do this you're going to want a small dowel or an applicator like this one. If you've got really long skinny fingers, you might be able to use your little finger to do that. Okay, but I'm just going to take and measure 2 inches here, and I'll put my thumbnail at that mark. And I'm just going to apply some glue to my applicator here. Alright, and now this is going to be the aft or rear end of the rocket. And now I'm just going to put this in without touching the sides until my thumbnail hits. And then I'm going to move around the inside of the rocket there, applying glue. Don't know if you can see that in the camera, but there's a nice ring of glue there now. And then I'll take my engine block, also called a thrust ring, put that in, and then I'm going to push it in using this spacer up until I get to that mark that I made. And I'm going to draw this right back out. You might be able to see there's a little sheen of glue there. We don't want that to get glued into place. And so now there is a bead of glue surrounding the engine block there as it pushed the glue forward, and we're just going to let this dry. I'm going to mark this though as the aft end so that later on I don't end up putting the fins on the wrong end. Now we can go back to the fins. So here's our fin guide, and we can cut this out. You can use scissors or hobby knife. These other things that are on here will be cut out as well. So that's why I wanted to do the engine block first before we cut all these patterns out. Okay, so if you look at our instructions here, we want the grain of the wood to be parallel with the leading edge of the fin, which is going to be the longest edge here. And so we'll just place these on our balsa wood fin material here like this, and you can trace the outline of the fin and then cut these out with your hobby knife. And I think you can just get 3 fins out of this. Yep. Okay. So they're showing 2 fins on a sheet. If you're really careful and put these in tightly, you can get all 3 fins on one sheet of balsa, and that way you've got the other sheet to correct mistakes, or you can just set it aside and maybe use it for another rocket. Now, something I'm going to do before I actually cut that out is I'm just going to take some fine sandpaper here on a sanding block and just quickly give it a once over here. Take off any really rough edges. Alright, so now I'm going to place this on here. Okay, now you can do this by simply tracing the fin, and my fin stock here is just a hair shorter than the fin cutout. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to make sure that my tip up here is up at the corner. Okay, and then I'm just going to lightly trace a line here. Make sure I can see it. Yep. Okay. And one of the things you could do on this, if it makes it easier for you, is copy the pattern onto a piece of cardstock and then cut out that cardstock and use it as a guide. Just make it a little bit easier to trace. Now, something the instructions don't mention is that you may want to seal these fins to make them even smoother. There are a variety of sanding sealers out there. Some are polyurethane based. They tend to take a little bit longer to dry. They're also not as safe for use around small children. I'm going to show you a way to use water-soluble wood filler as a sanding sealer. So now that I've got these outlined, I'm going to take my ruler as a straight edge. The first thing I'm just going to do is make the long cut for each fin. And this one looks like my pattern moved just a little bit there. Okay. So what I will do, yeah, it's I moved a little bit, but if I cut from this corner down to the line, that should correct it. So I can do that. And here you do want to make a couple of parallel cuts, one over the other, instead of trying to go through the whole thickness, because we're cutting kind of transversely through the grain, and it might be a little bit harder to do. And a good steel ruler is a wise investment for model rocketry. Now that my fins are cut out, I'm going to place them stacked together here and check to make sure that they're all the same size. So there's a little slight discrepancy there. And so I'm going to line them up all along the leading edge, and then I can adjust little discrepancies here by simply dragging the entire assembly over some medium or fine sandpaper. I'm using 120 grit here. And then recheck. This is also a good time to get rid of a little bit of this material that's on the trailing edge there. So you can just go through and at least lightly sand each edge to remove anything that might be sticking out a little bit. And check frequently to make sure that your stack has not shifted on you. There we go. Now, if you don't want to bother about sealing your fins, you can skip through the rest of this part and go right to applying the fins to the tube. Otherwise, I'm going to talk about how we can seal these and show you how to do that. For this part, you're going to need some wood filler here. And there are several companies that make this. This one's made by DAP. They call it plastic wood, even though it's not really plastic. Elmer's makes one as well, and they come either in tubes or in tubs, but all of them are a paste formulation that's meant to fill in grooves and cracks and such in wood. And what we want to do here is make this about a 4-to-1 ratio of paste to water. So I've got some water in here. It's not a lot. Probably about enough there. And depending on the exact formulation of what you're using, you may need a little more water or a little less. You might want to experiment with this before you go applying it to your fins. And then we're simply going to mix this up. I found that for this step, the kinds that come in the tub are a little bit easier to mix. The tube variety seems to be just a little bit more viscous. Okay, I'm going to continue this with a paintbrush. You want a relatively wide paintbrush so you can do the fins in just a couple of strokes. Don't use a really fancy paintbrush for this. In fact, I would just have 1 or 2 paintbrushes that you're going to use exclusively for this. Although it does clean out fairly easily. It's all water soluble, it's non-toxic, so if you're working with younger children, this is a good one to use. Okay, so that's about the consistency we want, kind of like thick latex paint. And now the fin, I'm going to take a long, thin, straight pin here, like you would find for dressmaking and such. And I'm going to insert it into the root edge in line with the grain. This doesn't have to go very far. and you want to be careful not to stick it through your finger, but we don't want it to come out either side as well. This is just going to give us something to hang on to, and when we're done, this will give us something to hang the fin itself to let it dry. Since this is water-based, you want to do both sides at once, otherwise it may curl. Alright, I'm just going to coat all the way in here. Some people like to do any rounding or shaping of the fins or airfoiling before they do this. Some will do it after. You don't need it on the root edge here. I've got some on. I'm just going to sand that off again though. Okay, and I'm going to do the other side. If you shape your fin after doing this, you can also just apply a little bit more to the edges if you need to. Alright, but I've completely filled in all of the wood grain there. And now to let this dry, if you have a small corrugated cardboard box, find an edge that has the corrugations visible, and we can just slide that on here, and that will let it dry. In this case, as you can see, it's a box full of old motor casings. So I'm going to do this with the other two fins off camera. And then when you're done and ready to clean up, just run this under some water, maybe with a little bit of dish detergent in it. Clean it out like you would any water-based paint. The leftover material here can just be thrown away. Again, it's non-toxic, won't hurt anything. So all of my fins have been coated now, and they're sitting here to dry. Depending on the temperature and humidity of your workspace, these will take about 30 to 60 minutes before they're ready to sand. So I'm going to set these aside, go on to marking the body tube, and then we'll come back to these and sand those flat and have them ready to go onto the tube. For our next step here, we'll need the fin marking guide. And again, this can be cut out of the instructions now that we've already put in the thrust ring. Or you can photocopy this as we did with the fin guide. And you'll want to have a small piece of tape handy, so I'm just going to get a little piece of masking tape here, set it aside. Now remember, we had one end of the rocket that we marked aft, and that's where this has to go. So I'm just going to wrap this around. And we want to line up these two alignment lines. And then we're going to tape the paper on there. Okay, so some of these are marked FL, those are fin lines, and then one is marked LL, that's going to be the launch lug line. And to start with, we'll simply mark on each side. There's that launch lug line. And I'm going to mark this with an L so I remember what it is. Okay, then I can just slide that off. Okay, and now we just need to draw a connecting line between the two. In fact, I would go from the forwardmost all the way down to the base of the tube, the aft end there. And you can do this in a door frame, or you can use a piece of angle aluminum, or if you have one of these, this is a tube marking guide made by Estes. that is basically a portable door frame. And so here I'm just going to find each of those tick marks and draw a line between them. Now the launch lug line I'm going to extend up just a little bit farther, just so I've got something better to align with when I put the launch lug on. Okay, and then there's another fin line. Oh, there it is. My last tick marks were really faint. That one goes there. Okay, so now we've got 4 lines there. Now something else you can do, and this isn't required, you'll see it in some model kits, not in others, and some Rocketeers just do it with everything. But you can take some fine or extra fine sandpaper and very lightly sand the tube where the fins are going to be. So it's the fins go right down to the aft end. And what this is doing is simply roughening up this smooth glassine finish and allows the glue to adhere just a little tighter. You don't need to do a lot, and you don't want it to go too wide or you'll lose the glassine finish that you'll want under your paint. And this just gives the glue a little extra to hold on to. That was a launch lug line, don't need to do that one there. Okay, I'm making this so that you can just barely see the line yet. And that's as deep as you need to go. Okay, so since the fins are still drying, we can go ahead and take a look at where that launch lug is going to be. Okay, so that's going to be 2 inches from the aft end. So that's going to be right here, and this is why I extended my launch lug line up just a little bit more than the fin line, so I'd have something to gauge it with. The launch lug itself is in this little package. It's going to go that far, so it's actually going to extend just a little bit beyond the line I had. And I will go ahead and roughen this area as well. Okay, and now I'm just going to set this aside and wait for my fins to dry. I've just cut out the shock cord mount here from the front page of the instructions. And this is something we can do while we're waiting for the fins to finish drying with their sanding sealer, because this will go in the forward end of the rocket. And we'll need the shock cord itself. Okay, and what we're going to do is place the shock cord here just slightly off center, and then with glue on here we will fold the 1 into the 2 and then the 2 into the 3. Now I'm going to go ahead and pre-fold these to make things easier. And now I'm just going to run some glue down here. And I'm going to spread this out so it's nice and even. So I get a nice film of glue all the way over this. Alright, and good idea to put something down to protect your work area so you don't end up gluing it as well. And now I'm going to go ahead and place this in. And again, I'm going to make this a little off center, because what's going to happen here is the 2, as it folds into the 3, I want the shock cord to lay beside itself, not on top of itself. So now I can just fold this over and then fold it once more. And my shock cord's coming out just a little bit off center, and that's fine. Okay, and now I'm going to impart a bow to this, because this surface is going to get glued to the inside surface of the body tube. Now, according to our directions, okay, this needs to be at least an inch from the forward end of the tube. And the reason for that is so that the shoulder of the nose cone does not impinge upon the shock cord mount. And this is a place where if you've got really skinny fingers, this is easier to do. What I'm going to do, since I don't have really skinny fingers, is take some glue on an applicator and go down. I'm going down about 1.5 inches here. And I want to put down enough glue to fully come into contact with that shock cord mount. And then now I'm going to put this curved side on the same side that I have my glue. Okay, I'm just going to gently push this down. And I'm trying to be careful so that I don't glue it as it's being pushed down here. Okay, once I get to my patch of glue, I can move that about. Okay, so I'm just reaching it with the tip of my pinky, and I'm using my hand behind that as a support so I can press that down as hard as I can. You can also use a dowel on the handle of a tool, just don't cut yourself here. But we want to get that shock cord mount as flat as we possibly can. Okay, I'm going to set that aside and let that glue dry. The filler on all of my fins has dried, and we're ready to sand these now. This is going to be really messy, so I'm going to put down a paper towel here to take up some of the dust. To sand these, I'm going to be using some 220 grit sandpaper on a sanding block here. And if we just lay these flat, we can just sand off the excess. I'm just going to turn this a little bit to get the edge. But you should sand this down just until you can see grain again. And the idea here now is as you sand that down, the deep parts of the grain will still be filled, and everything else, the fine points of the wood that didn't need filling, will be on the top here. And so you should have a very smooth surface when we're done. Okay, and you can certainly take the pin out at this point. Go ahead and make sure that you flatten the root edge. And here, go ahead and sand till you see grain again, because we want that porous wood grain to help attach the fin to the body tube. And then for the other edges, these can be rounded off. And so just as you start sanding the corner edge, and then you simply rotate over as you do so, and that will help streamline the fins. So if you look at it in cross section now, it's got a rounded edge there. The tip edges I usually just square off, although you can round or taper those as well. And the same is true of the trailing edge. So if you want to get something that approaches a true airfoil here, you can round the leading edge and then taper to a knife edge, the trailing edge there. The drawback to that is when you taper those edges, it makes them weaker and they're going to be more susceptible to cracking. So it depends on, are you trying to make this go as high as it possibly can, or do you want it to be able to withstand lots of launches and landings? So there's one fin. I'm going to go ahead and do the other ones off camera. Now if you run into a problem when if your fin comes out a little curved due to the water in it, go ahead and sand it down again. Sometimes just the process of the pressure on it as you're sanding will straighten it out again. But if not, what you can do is hold this in some steam for about a minute. So if you have a teapot or something like that, just steam the fin, put it on a flat surface, and put a flat weight on top of that, and let that go overnight. When it dries out, it should be straight again. I've sanded all the fins. They're nice and smooth now. Recall though that this is a water-based material, and so you'll want to make sure and seal these fins with some primer as soon as we get the rocket assembled, especially if you're going to use acrylic type of paints on it. If you brush on acrylic paint directly over this wood filler, it may come loose. So make sure you use a non-water-based primer first. Coming back to our body tube, the shock cord that we put in last time is now completely dry and in place. And I'm just going to tuck it out of the way for a little while here. And now we're going to come back to the lines that we marked earlier. So we've got our fin lines there, and to attach the fins, we simply need our wood or white glue. Okay, and so we're going to apply a thin bead of glue here. One of the things that new Rocketeers will often make a mistake of is using too much glue. Because, you know, if a little glue is good, more is even better, right? Well, not necessarily. So what we want is a nice, thin, even coating here. And what I'm going to do is place this up against a fin line, and make sure you're on a fin line, not the launch lug line. The base of the root edge will be flush with the aft end of the tube. Okay, so I'm just going to touch this to my line, and I'm going to take it off again. And I'm going to let this dry for 60 seconds and allow it to get tacky. 60 seconds have passed, and so now I'm going to put this back on. And the idea here is by letting it dry for a little bit, the glue gets tackier and it sticks better, so that now when we put it back on, we don't have to keep holding it. So now I'm just going to look at it edge on and make sure that my fin is straight up and down and also straight in relation to the body tube. Okay, and now I'm just going to let that dry for about 20 minutes, maybe a little longer. If you're using wood glue, it will dry quicker. If you're using white glue, it takes a little bit longer. The main thing is be patient here. Okay, another place that new Rocketeers go a little astray is they're wanting to get all the fins on at once, and we end up with crooked fins or drooping fins or uneven fins. So take a little bit of time here. It's going to take you a good hour and a half or so to put all the fins on properly, allowing them to dry. I'm going to do the other two fins off camera, and when we get back, we'll apply the launch lug. My fins are all glued on, and they look to be nice and straight. So the next task is to add the launch lug, and this is in the same package with the streamer. And this is going to go on in much the same way. The only difference is that we really don't have to worry about it falling off once it's glued into place. You still can use the little tacky trick with this. So I'm going to add a bead of glue here. And remember, we marked the tube earlier. So on the launch lug line, 2 inches from the aft end of the rocket, that's where the aft end of the launch lug is going to go. And so just like I did with my fins, I'm going to touch it there and let this get tacky for 60 seconds, and then we'll come back. 60 seconds have passed, and so now I'm simply going to put this back on into the tacky glue, and I'm going to use the line to make sure it's aligned that way, and I can look down the length of the rocket as well. And I can look through the launch lug at the launch lug line, and everything lines up. Okay, so I'm going to let this dry for just a little while. In fact, if you're careful about it, you can let this dry upside down, assuming your glue is tacky enough. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And I'm going to put my streamer on now. Alright, so we're just going to tape the streamer onto the shock cord. And for this, I don't recommend masking tape unless you've got one that's really sticky. Instead, use either cellophane tape or electrical tape. So here I have some electrical tape. Mine happens to be colored, it doesn't have to be. I'm just going to cut this at about the same width as the streamer. And then I'm simply going to take the shock cord here and place this about 1/3 of the way from the end. So roughly about there. And then I'll take the end of the streamer and make that a little straighter. Put that here, and then just fold the other part of the tape over along with the shock cord there. And that should hold its position fairly well. And then the last thing we need to do structurally here is to add the nose cone. And here all you have to do is just put on a double knot through the eye of the nose cone. So 2 half hitches, one over the other. Okay, and then pull this from both directions to make sure that we don't have any loose spots. And we want to have a little bit here on the free end, but not so much that it can get caught between the shoulder of the nose cone and the body tube. So I'm going to cut about half of that off. And then I like to add just a little dab of glue into the knot. And just kind of work that in there. And that's just to help the shock cord from untying itself. We can let that dry. Okay, coming back to our fins, remember I said we didn't want a lot of glue to begin with so that it would dry quickly, but now we need to reinforce that, so we're going to add some fin fillets, and to do that we'll just add a bead of glue here along the joint where the fin and the body tube meet, and I'm just going to take my finger and smooth that out. And any excess I can move to the next fin. And what this is doing is creating a curved surface between the fin and the body tube, and this reinforces the strength of our joint and also reduces something called interference drag, which happens basically any place that you have a sharp angle between two surfaces. I'm just going to add a little more here and continue this all the way around. I need just a little more there. And then I'm just going to go through here quickly and check for any stray glue that I don't want somewhere. It looks pretty good. I don't know what that word is I just said, but I meant to say it looks pretty good. And then once the glue on the launch lug completely dries, you can add a fillet in here as well. I'm going to just end the video here though, because we are done with this part. Now when we dry this, you want to dry it in a horizontal position. Don't dry it straight up like this or on the fins. And the reason for that is the gravity will pull the liquid glue here one way or another if it's on an end. You'll end up with bulging fillets. If you just let it dry horizontal, you can prop it on the nose cone like that. That'll allow them to dry uniformly and you get better fillets that way. Okay. One last thing on assembling the rocket. When you go to launch, you'll need to add some wadding there. And here I just want to focus on the streamer. Instead of trying to roll it from its end, start by making a series of lengthwise folds where you simply fold it in half upon itself several times. And then once you get to something manageable, you can go ahead and roll that up. And now this can be placed into the rocket along with the excess shock cord here. And if you check the instructions, it has all this in there as well in the launch directions. Okay, and then we need to make this get down, and you want to make sure that it gets past the edge of the shock cord mount just so it doesn't get caught there. Okay, and then that goes together here. Now you want to do a test here, give it a little shake. If the nose cone comes out like that, that means it's too loose. And to fix that, just add a little bit of masking tape. I just do this a little bit at a time. You don't need to go completely around the shoulder. So I'm just going to give it a little bit here. And usually about half a circumference is all you need. So now if I shake it, it's not coming out. Alright, so all I need to do here is now add fillets to the launch lug, let all those fillets dry, and then you can finish this however you want to. I don't go into finishing on most of these videos. Spray paint, hand paint, markers, paint pens, whatever suits your fancy. Do remember, if you use the water-based sealer on those fins though, to prime those before you use any type of acrylic or water-based paint on the rocket. And with that, I hope you have a good launch, a safe recovery, and I'll be back next time.